You ever meet someone so drunk with power that they start making up rules just to control others? Let me tell you about Margaret, the self-proclaimed emergency response coordinator of Willow Creek Estates, who turned my peaceful suburban life into a 3-month nightmare, all because I dared to park in my own driveway. I used to think those crazy HOA stories on Reddit were exaggerated. You know the ones, power-tripping board members, made-up violations, absolutely insane demands. Man, was I wrong. My story actually ended with police lights flashing and someone in handcuffs, but not who you'd expect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I moved into Willow Creek Estates last spring, a quiet suburban community just outside of Portland. On paper, it was perfect. Mature trees lining the streets, well-maintained homes, and a reasonable HOA that mostly focused on keeping property values up. The monthly fees weren't cheap, but the amenities seemed worth it. A community pool, tennis courts, and walking trails throughout the neighborhood. Plus, the location was just 20 minutes from my new job at the tech startup downtown. The first 2 months were exactly what I'd hoped for. I got to know some neighbors, started a small garden in my backyard, after getting proper HOA approval, of course, and settled into a comfortable routine. The HOA rules seemed straightforward. Basic stuff about maintaining your lawn, approved. Paint colors and keeping trash bins out of sight. Nothing too restrictive. Then came the day I bought my new truck. Now, this wasn't some monster vehicle or anything outrageous, just a standard Ford F-150 that I needed for weekend camping trips and occasional home improvement projects. I parked it in my driveway, just like my old sedan, thinking nothing of it. That's when I met Margaret. I was unloading groceries when I heard this sharp, authoritative voice behind me. "Excuse me, you can't park there." I turned around to find this woman in her mid-50s, wearing what I can only describe as a neighborhood watch uniform she'd designed herself, complete with a laminated badge hanging from a lanyard around her neck. "I'm sorry," I said, genuinely confused. My truck was completely within my property lines, nowhere near the street or sidewalk. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she marched closer, her sensible shoes clicking against the pavement with military precision. "This is an emergency access zone," she declared, gesturing vaguely at my entire driveway. "All vehicles must be parked in garages or designated street spaces to maintain clear access for emergency vehicles." I looked around, bewildered. My driveway was standard width, leading straight to my garage. There were no signs, no markings, nothing indicating any kind of emergency route. "I don't understand," I said. "This is my private driveway." That's when she dropped the bomb. "I'm Margaret Wellington, Emergency Response Coordinator for Willow Creek Estates. I personally designed our emergency access protocols after 15 years of consulting with various safety departments." She paused for effect, clearly waiting for me to be impressed. "Your driveway falls within our primary response route. Section 8, paragraph 3 of our community guidelines clearly states—" I politely interrupted her. "I've read the guidelines pretty carefully. There's nothing about driveways being emergency routes." Big mistake. Margaret's face flushed red faster than a traffic light. "Listen here," she snapped, jabbing a finger in my direction. "I've lived here for 20 years. I've seen what happens when emergency vehicles can't get through. You're new here, so I'll give you one warning. Move your truck to the street, or you'll be hearing from the board." Before I could respond, she'd already spun around and was power-walking away, speaking rapidly into what looked like a walkie-talkie clipped to her shoulder. I stood there, groceries forgotten, wondering what exactly I'd gotten myself into. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. Margaret's crusade about emergency access would escalate into something nobody in the neighborhood expected, eventually leading to a showdown that would involve police, security cameras, and a community meeting that people still talk about today. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how things went from bad to completely insane. After that first encounter with Margaret, I decided to do some digging. I'm a software engineer by trade, so research is kind of my thing. I spent that evening going through every single HOA document I had, bylaws, community guidelines, architectural standards, even the original development plans from when Willow Creek Estates was built in 1995. Guess what? Not a single mention of emergency access routes through private driveways. The next morning, I reached out to my neighbor Tom, who'd lived here for about 5 years. He was watering his roses when I walked over, coffee in hand. Hey, quick question. Have you ever heard anything about emergency access protocols for our driveways? Tom nearly dropped his watering can. Oh God, you've met Margaret, haven't you? He looked around nervously before lowering his voice. Let me guess, she gave you the whole emergency response coordinator speech? Turns out, Margaret had appointed herself to this position after retiring from her job as a middle school vice principal 3 years ago. The HOA board never officially created or approved such a role, but they'd learned it was easier to let her play pretend than deal with her constant complaints. She used to focus on pool safety, Tom explained, still speaking in hushed tones. Had this whole thing about designated swimming lanes for different age groups. When people ignored her, she started writing down license plate numbers of cars parked near the pool and reporting them as suspicious vehicles to the police. I was about to ask more questions when I noticed Margaret power walking down the sidewalk, her signature lanyard swinging with each determined step. She was carrying what looked like a measuring tape and a clipboard. Tom immediately retreated into his garage, mouthing good luck as he disappeared. Margaret made a show of measuring the width of my driveway, writing something down on her clipboard with dramatic flourishes. I watched from my front window as she took photos with her phone, muttering to herself the entire time. Then she pulled out a bright orange piece of paper from her clipboard and started walking toward my front door. Before she could reach it, I opened the door. "Can I help you with something, Margaret?" She straightened up, clearly startled that I'd confronted her. "I'm conducting an official emergency access survey," she declared, holding up her clipboard like a shield. "Your driveway is 17% narrower than recommended emergency vehicle width parameters." I couldn't help myself. "Recommended by whom, exactly?" Her eyes narrowed. "I have extensive documentation from various safety consultants. Not that I need to justify myself to you." She thrust the orange paper in my direction. "This is an official notice of violation. You have 48 hours to relocate your vehicle to an approved parking zone." I took the paper, noting it was printed on regular orange copy paper with clip art of emergency vehicles at the top. "Margaret, this isn't an official HOA violation notice, and I've reviewed all the guidelines. There's nothing about emergency access routes through private driveways." "Oh, you think you know better than someone with decades of emergency response experience?" Her voice was getting louder, attracting attention from a few neighbors who were pretending not to watch. "I've coordinated with fire departments. I've designed evacuation protocols. I've been to actual emergency response training," I interrupted. Her face turned an impressive shade of red. "I'll have you know I attended 3 FEMA webinars last year." She jabbed her finger toward my truck. "When emergency vehicles can't get through because of your obstruction, you'll be personally liable. I'm documenting everything." As she stormed off, I noticed Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor from across the street, shaking her head from her porch. Once Margaret was out of earshot, she walked over. "You know," she said with a slight smile, "my son's a firefighter at the Portland station. Would you like his professional opinion on our neighborhood's emergency access?" I grinned. "Mrs. Chen, I would love that. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and Margaret had just given me an idea. If she wanted to talk about emergency vehicle access, why not get some actual first responders involved?" Little did I know, bringing in real emergency response Professionals would send Margaret into a spiral that would make her previous behavior look completely rational in comparison. But at least now I had a plan, and more importantly, I had allies who were tired of Margaret's self-appointed authority. Mrs. Chen wasn't kidding about getting her son involved. The next day, while I was working from home, I spotted a Portland Fire Department SUV pulling into my driveway. A tall, uniformed firefighter stepped out, Battalion Chief James Chen, according to his badge. He introduced himself with a warm smile that reminded me of his mother's. "Mom told me about your interesting situation," he said, pulling out a tablet. "I brought our department's official guidelines for residential emergency access. Mind if I take a look around?" As Chief Chen measured and photographed my driveway, I noticed Margaret emerging from her house 3 doors down. She practically sprinted toward us, her lanyard bouncing wildly. The look on her face was priceless, a mix of excitement at seeing an actual emergency responder and horror that he was talking to me. "Chief, thank goodness you're here," Margaret called out, slightly out of breath. "I've been trying to tell everyone about the serious access violations in our neighborhood." She shot me a triumphant look before turning back to Chen. "I have extensive documentation of all the infractions. Just let me grab my binder." "Ma'am," Chief Chen interrupted politely, "I'm actually here at my mother's request to provide an official assessment." He gestured to my driveway. "And I can tell you right now, this setup meets all county and state requirements for emergency access. In fact, it's about 2 feet wider than the minimum requirement." Margaret's face fell. But my measurements clearly show preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Are you using the updated 2024 Portland Fire Code?" Chen asked, his tone professional but with a hint of amusement. "Because I helped write those guidelines." Margaret sputtered, her face reddening. Well, my research indicates." "Your research?" Chen raised an eyebrow. "Would you mind sharing your credentials? Are you with the fire department or emergency services?" I had to bite my lip to keep from smiling as Margaret's authority facade crumbled. "I've attended several webinars," she managed, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I see." Chen nodded professionally. "Well, I'd be happy to review these access violations you're concerned about. As Battalion Chief, I can provide official documentation of any genuine safety issues." Margaret suddenly remembered she had somewhere else to be. I need to compile my files," she muttered, retreating quickly. As she walked away, I could have sworn I heard her walkie-talkie crackling with static. Was she actually talking to anyone on that thing? Chief Chen spent the next 30 minutes doing a thorough inspection of my property and the surrounding area. He provided me with official documentation confirming that my driveway not only met but exceeded all emergency access requirements. He even added a note about proper vehicle parking guidelines for residential driveways. "Mind if I keep a copy of this?" he asked, photographing his report. "Something tells me other neighbors might need this information." After he left, I scanned the report and emailed it to the HOA board, copying Margaret as a professional courtesy. Within an hour, my phone started blowing up with texts from neighbors. Apparently, Margaret had been on a crusade about emergency access violations for months, leaving her unofficial notices on cars, patio furniture, and even a kid's bicycle that was improperly parked in a front yard. But Margaret wasn't done. Oh no! Later that evening, as I was cooking dinner, I heard a commotion outside. Margaret was back, this time with orange safety cones and what appeared to be surveyor's tape. She was placing cones along my driveway and attempting to create some kind of makeshift emergency lane markers with the tape. I grabbed my phone and started recording. This was getting ridiculous, but at least now I had official documentation proving she was out of line. What I didn't expect was what happened next. Margaret pulled out a can of orange spray paint and started approaching my driveway with a determined look in her eye. That's when I decided it was time to call the non-emergency police line. I had tried being reasonable. I had gotten official documentation. I had even kept my cool when she was measuring my property without permission. But I drew the line at property damage. Little did I know that call would set off a chain of events that would expose far more than just Margaret's fake emergency protocols. I stayed on the phone with dispatch while recording Margaret's activities. The dispatcher asked me to keep a safe distance, but continue documenting everything. Margaret was now meticulously painting orange lines along my driveway's edges, muttering about proper emergency lane width into her ever-present walkie-talkie. 2 patrol cars arrived within minutes, lights off to avoid causing a scene. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Bennett approached calmly, taking in the situation. Margaret, so focused on her painting, didn't notice them until Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Ma'am, could you put down the spray paint, please?" Margaret spun around, paint still raised. Her eyes lit up at the sight of law enforcement, exactly what I'd expected. She'd finally have real authorities to back up her emergency protocols, or so she thought. "Officers, thank goodness you're here." She straightened her lanyard importantly. "I'm Margaret Wellington, Emergency Response Coordinator for Willow Creek Estates. I'm just marking official emergency access lanes as per safety protocols." "Officer," Bennett took out his notebook. "Could I see some identification, Ms. Wellington, and any official documentation authorizing you to mark private property?" "Of course. I have everything right here." Margaret reached into her messenger bag, pulling out a thick binder labeled Emergency Protocols in large red letters. She handed over her driver's license, along with what looked like a laminated certificate. Officer Rodriguez examined the certificate, while his partner ran Margaret's ID. "Ma'am, this appears to be a completion certificate for an online FEMA webinar. This doesn't authorize you to modify private property." "But I'm the emergency response coordinator." Margaret's voice rose an octave. "I've designed all the safety protocols for this community. Ask anyone." "Actually," I interjected, pulling up the email on my phone, "I have documentation from Battalion Chief Chen of Portland Fire Department from earlier today, confirming my driveway meets all emergency access requirements." I showed the officers the official report. Officer Bennett reviewed the report while Margaret's face went through several interesting color changes. "Ms. Wellington," he said finally, "did the HOA board authorize you to paint on private property?" Well, they appointed me as emergency response coordinator." "That's not actually true," came a new voice. We all turned to see Richard Martinez, our HOA board president, walking up my driveway. Apparently, someone had called him about the commotion. "Margaret, we've talked about this. The board never created or appointed an emergency response coordinator position." Margaret's composure cracked. "But the webinars, the protocols, I've spent 3 years developing these systems." She frantically flipped through her binder, papers spilling onto my driveway. "I have documentation of every violation, every potential hazard. The community needs these protocols." Officer Rodriguez picked up one of the fallen papers. It was a detailed map of the neighborhood with red lines drawn everywhere, marking what appeared to be Margaret's imagined emergency routes through people's private properties. Notes in the margins listed violations with residents' names, addresses, and vehicle descriptions. "Ms. Wellington," Officer Rodriguez said carefully, "have you been documenting residents' personal information and movements?" "For emergency purposes." "Only..." Margaret clutched her binder defensively. "Someone has to keep track of potential obstacles and security risks." Richard looked increasingly uncomfortable as he glanced through more fallen papers. "Margaret, these look like surveillance. Notes. You've been recording when people leave for work, what cars they drive, when they have visitors." The officers exchanged looks. What had started as a simple property damage call was turning into something more concerning. Officer Bennett stepped closer to Margaret, who was still clutching her. Bind her like a lifeline. Ma'am, we need to discuss the vandalism of private property and these unauthorized surveillance activities. Please step over to the patrol car. Margaret's face hardened. This is exactly what's wrong with this community. Nobody takes emergency preparedness seriously. I have protocols. I have documentation. I have a lot of explaining to do, officer. Rodriguez finished firmly, starting with the vandalism we witnessed. As the officers led a protesting Margaret to their patrol car, Richard turned to me with a grimace. I am so sorry about this. The board had no idea she was keeping records like this. We just thought she was enthusiastic about safety. Looking at the scattered papers covered in Margaret's meticulous notes about her neighbors' daily routines, I realized this went way beyond an overzealous HOA busybody. Little did we know, those papers would lead to an emergency HOA board meeting that would reveal just how deep Margaret's protocols really went. After the police left with Margaret, Richard stayed behind to help me clean up the scattered papers from my driveway. What we found made both of us increasingly uncomfortable. The documentation went far beyond simple parking violations or emergency access routes. Margaret had created an entire shadow surveillance system of the neighborhood. Look at this, Richard said, holding up a detailed spreadsheet. She's got everyone's work schedules, regular visitors, even notes about what we order for delivery. He flipped through more pages, his face growing increasingly pale. There are photos of people's garage codes, timestamps of when lights go on and off. This is insane. I picked up another paper that had blown against my garden bed. It was a hand-drawn map of what Margaret labeled Phase 2 emergency response zones. She had actually plotted routes through people's backyards, marking spots for emergency access points, which basically meant breaking down sections of private fences to create her imagined emergency corridors. Did you know about any of this? I asked Richard, who was now sitting on my front steps looking shell-shocked. He shook his head. We knew she was intense about safety protocols. She'd show up at every board meeting with proposals for emergency response training, wanting to conduct mandatory evacuation drills at 6 a.m. on Sundays. We always voted no, but we had no idea she was doing all this anyway. Just then, Tom came jogging over from his house. Hey, I saw the police. Is everything okay? He stopped short when he saw all the papers spread out on my driveway. What's all this? Richard held up one of Margaret's surveillance logs. Apparently, Margaret's been keeping very detailed records of all of us. Tom's face went white as he grabbed the paper. Wait, is this why she always seemed to know when I was having my girlfriend over? She's got all my date nights logged here, times, my girlfriend's car model, everything. He started frantically flipping through other papers. This is beyond creepy. More neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Chen brought out her famous green tea, and soon my driveway became an impromptu neighborhood meeting as people discovered just how extensively Margaret had been monitoring their lives. She has notes about my grandchildren's visits, Mrs. Chen said, looking through a detailed log. Times they arrive, what games they play in the backyard. She even noted when my grandson scraped his knee last month. Sarah Johnson, a nurse who lived 2 doors down, found a whole section dedicated to her suspicious behavior. She's got every night shift I worked marked as potential criminal activity because my lights were on at odd hours. Sarah laughed incredulously. I'm an ER nurse, for heaven's sake. But the real shock came when we found Margaret's incident response scenarios folder. She had written detailed plans for various emergencies she imagined might happen, including using her position as emergency response coordinator to enter people's homes when they weren't there. Look at this, I pointed out to Richard. She's got copies of work schedules marked with optimal inspection windows, times when people would be away, and she could verify emergency preparedness compliance. Richard was already on his phone, calling an emergency HOA board meeting for the next evening. "This goes way beyond overzealous safety concerns," he said grimly. "We need to address this immediately." As neighbors continued going through the papers, we found more disturbing details. Margaret had created detailed profiles of every resident, including personal information none of us had ever shared with her. She had logs of when teenagers in the neighborhood came home after curfew, notes about which residents had suspicious Amazon delivery frequencies, and even recordings of conversations she'd overheard while pretending to do her safety patrols. "You know what's really ironic?" Tom said, holding up one of her emergency protocol documents. "For someone so obsessed with safety, she's created the biggest security risk this neighborhood has ever had. She's got everyone's patterns and personal information documented right here." While we were still processing everything, my phone buzzed with a text from Officer Rodriguez. They wanted to know if we'd found anything in Margaret's dropped papers that might be relevant to their investigation. Looking at the small mountain of surveillance documents spread across my driveway, I replied that yes, we'd found quite a bit, and they might want to bring a bigger evidence box. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. the next evening, in the community center. I arrived 20 minutes early to find the parking lot already packed. Clearly, word had spread fast about Margaret's documentation activities. The usual folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows, but people kept bringing in more as residents streamed in. I'd never seen anywhere near this level of attendance at a regular HOA meeting. Richard and the other board members sat at a long table at the front, looking through copies of some of Margaret's more concerning documents. They'd spent the day organizing the papers into categories: surveillance logs, unauthorized property modifications, personal information collection, and planned emergency response activities. The tension in the room was palpable. Neighbors who normally just exchanged friendly waves were huddled in groups, comparing notes about strange incidents over the past 3 years that suddenly made sense. Sarah, the ER nurse, was showing her colleagues a thick folder labeled "Suspicious Night Activities" that contained detailed logs of their comings and goings during hospital shifts. At exactly 7 p.m., Richard called the meeting to order. The usual mundane HOA topics were skipped entirely as he addressed the elephant in the room. "As most of you know by now," he began, "yesterday's incident with Margaret Wellington revealed some deeply concerning activities that have been occurring in our community. Before we discuss the board's response, Officers Rodriguez and Bennett from Portland PD would like to address the community." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward, holding up one of Margaret's binders. "We've begun a preliminary investigation into Ms. Wellington's activities. What we've found so far suggests numerous potential violations of privacy laws and property rights. We're here tonight to gather formal statements from any residents who believe they may have been targeted or monitored." The floodgates opened. For the next hour, neighbors took turns sharing stories that painted a disturbing picture of Margaret's 3-year reign as self-appointed emergency response coordinator. The Patels, who lived next to Margaret, described how she'd installed motion-activated lights pointing directly into their windows, claiming they were emergency guidance beacons. When they complained about the glare, she reported them to the city for obstruction of emergency safety measures. Jennifer Anderson, a high school teacher, discovered Margaret had been photographing her teenage son and his friends whenever they used the community pool, documenting what she called potential safety violations. The photos were all carefully labeled with the kids' names and addresses, but the most shocking revelation came from Bob Wilson, our neighborhood handyman. "Last month, Margaret hired me to install new locks on her back gate," he said, standing up from his seat. "While I was working, I saw something strange in her garage. She had multiple security monitors set up, showing different parts of the neighborhood. I assumed they were just pointed at her own property, but now Officer Bennett immediately took Bob aside for a detailed statement. The revelation that Margaret might have unauthorized surveillance cameras around the neighborhood created a whole new wave of concern. Richard tried to maintain order as more residents came forward with stories. Margaret had apparently convinced several elderly neighbors to give her spare keys to their homes in case of emergency. She had created detailed logs of which residents had security systems and which didn't. She even had notes about which dogs in the neighborhood might interfere with emergency response protocols, and suggested they be relocated for community safety. As the meeting progressed, the board's attorney, Michael Chang, arrived with some concerning news. "We've reviewed the HOA's insurance policies," he announced. "There's a possibility the association could be liable for Margaret's actions since she was representing herself as an HOA official. Even though no such position existed, we need to take immediate action to protect the community." The board voted unanimously on several emergency measures. A formal statement would be issued clarifying that Margaret had never held any official position. All residents would be notified to check their properties for unauthorized surveillance equipment. 3. The HOA would hire a security firm to sweep the community for hidden cameras. 4. Lock changes would be offered at the HOA's expense to anyone who had given Margaret access. 5. A complete audit of HOA records would be conducted to identify any other unauthorized activities. As the meeting was wrapping up, my phone buzzed with a text from Officer Rodriguez. "Search warrant approved for Wellington residents. Executing tomorrow morning. Might want to stick around. Could use more witness statements depending on what we find." Looking around at my neighbors' worried faces, I had a feeling tomorrow would bring even more surprises. Margaret's obsession with emergency preparedness had prepared us for all kinds of disasters, except, ironically, the one she created herself. The next morning dawned with unusual activity in our normally quiet neighborhood. 3 police vehicles and what looked like a technical surveillance team arrived at Margaret's house around 8 a.m. Officers Rodriguez and Bennett had asked me and several other neighbors to be available for questions, so I set up my laptop to work from my front porch, giving me a clear view of the proceedings. The scene that unfolded was unlike anything I'd expected. The tech team emerged from Margaret's garage carrying not just monitors, but an entire professional-grade surveillance setup, multiple hard drives, a sophisticated computer system, and what appeared to be a server rack were carefully documented and removed from the premises. "You seeing this?" Tom texted me, sending a photo from his angle next door. "She had more surveillance equipment than our local Best Buy." Officer Rodriguez walked over to where I was sitting, looking troubled. "We found something concerning we'd like you to verify," he said. "Can you come take a look at some footage?" Inside Margaret's garage, what I saw left me speechless. One entire wall was covered with a giant whiteboard, divided into sections. For each street in the neighborhood, color-coded sticky notes tracked residents' routines with military precision. But it was the monitors that really caught my attention. One of them showed a crystal-clear view of my driveway, the very spot where yesterday's confrontation had taken place. She had high-definition cameras mounted on light poles throughout the neighborhood, Officer Bennett explained. "Disguised as security lights. This system has been recording 24/7 for at least 2 years. The technical team had found dozens of terabytes of stored footage, all meticulously organized by date and location. Margaret had created what amounted to a personal surveillance center, complete with motion detection alerts and automated logging software. "Look at this," one of the tech officers called out, pointing to a detailed spreadsheet on Margaret's computer. "She's got algorithms set up to flag suspicious behavior, anything that deviates from residents' normal patterns. As they continued the search, more disturbing discoveries emerged. In Margaret's home office, they found detailed dossiers on every household in Willow Creek Estates. She had copies of utility bills, mail photos, and even credit reports she'd somehow obtained. Her emergency protocols were actually elaborate plans to monitor and control the neighborhood's activities. The most chilling discovery came when they found her planning calendar. Margaret had scheduled what she called emergency response readiness tests, dates where she planned to deliberately trigger neighborhood-wide emergencies to evaluate response protocols. She was going to start pulling fire alarms in the middle of the night, Officer Rodriguez explained, showing me the calendar. Then document how long it took people to evacuate. She had it all mapped out, which alarms to trigger first, how to block certain exits to test alternative escape routes. Richard arrived mid-morning, looking shell-shocked after being briefed by the officers. "The HOA's attorney is on his way," he said. "This goes so far beyond anything we imagined. She wasn't just watching us, she was planning to actively interfere with people's lives under the guise of emergency preparation." As the search continued, neighbors gathered in small groups on their lawns, watching the steady stream of evidence being removed from Margaret's house. Mrs. Chen brought out coffee and her homemade almond cookies, turning the surreal scene into something of an impromptu neighborhood watch party. "You know what's ironic?" Sarah said, sipping her coffee. "She was so obsessed with preparing for emergencies, but she created the biggest emergency this neighborhood has ever had." By early afternoon, the technical team had removed over 30 hidden cameras from around the neighborhood. They found them disguised as everything from birdhouses to landscape lighting. Margaret had created a surveillance network that would have made any intelligence agency proud. The officers were particularly interested in a locked room in Margaret's basement. When they finally got it open, they found what she called her Emergency Response Command Center, a fully equipped operation room with multiple monitors, radio equipment, and what appeared to be a professional-grade dispatch console. She even had emergency vehicle lights and sirens stored down here, Officer Bennett said, photographing the equipment. Was she planning to run her own emergency response team? The most revealing find was a journal where Margaret had documented her mission to protect the neighborhood. The entries showed an increasingly paranoid mindset, with elaborate conspiracies about potential threats that only she could see. She had convinced herself that her neighbors were helpless sheep who needed her constant surveillance and intervention to stay safe. As the day wore on, the true scope of Margaret's operation became clear. This wasn't just about parking spaces or emergency access routes. She had created an elaborate fantasy world where she was the guardian of neighborhood safety, justified in taking any action she deemed necessary to maintain her version of order. Looking at all the evidence being catalogued and removed, I couldn't help but wonder how had none of us noticed the extent of her surveillance. Then again, maybe that was exactly why Margaret's plan had worked for so long. She had hidden her obsessive monitoring behind a facade of civic concern that seemed just plausible enough to ignore. By evening, the police had finished their initial search of Margaret's house, but the neighborhood was far from settling down. News vans had started appearing at the entrance to Willow Creek Estates, drawn by tips about the massive police presence. Richard was dealing with a flood of calls from local media, while the HOA's attorney tried to manage the growing legal implications of the situation. I was just finishing up my work-from-home day when Officer Rodriguez asked if I could help identify some specific footage they'd found. In one of Margaret's surveillance files, they'd discovered extensive video of my initial move-in day 6 months ago. The footage showed her documenting everything I brought into my house, with detailed notes about what she called potential emergency hazards. "She literally catalogued every box I unpacked," I said, watching the footage in disbelief. "Look at these notes. She's got a list of my furniture and electronics, even details about my home office setup. The officers had found similar logs. For every new resident who'd moved in over the past 3 years, Margaret had created detailed threat assessments for each household, ranking them based on what she perceived as their emergency preparedness level. As we were reviewing the footage, Sarah rushed over from her house holding her phone. "You need to see this," she said, pulling up a social media post. Margaret's daughter had apparently posted a long message defending her mother's actions, claiming she was just passionate about community safety and that we were all ungrateful for her dedication. According to this post, Sarah continued, scrolling through comments, Margaret's been doing similar things in her church group and at her part-time job at the library. She's got emergency protocols for everything. Officer Bennett joined us, looking concerned. We've been getting calls from other communities where Ms. Wellington has been involved. Apparently, she tried to implement similar surveillance systems at her previous residence in Seattle, but moved away when neighbors started asking questions. The revelation that this wasn't Margaret's first attempt at creating a surveillance state sent ripples through the community. Several neighbors began sharing stories of their own encounters with her at various community organizations. "She volunteered at my kids' school for 1 semester, Jennifer Anderson said, joining our growing group. Had to step down after she tried to install her own security cameras in the hallways without permission. The school never pressed charges because she claimed it was all for student safety. The HOA board called an impromptu meeting in the community center to address the growing concerns. This time, they'd invited a cybersecurity expert to discuss the implications of Margaret's surveillance system. Based on what we've found, the expert explained, she was using sophisticated pattern recognition software to track resident behaviors. The system would flag anything it considered abnormal, working late, having visitors outside usual hours, even ordering takeout at unusual times. The creepiest part was discovering that Margaret had created what she called resident profiles, detailed psychological assessments of each neighbor based on their observed behaviors. She had categorized everyone according to their perceived compliance with her emergency protocols. "Look at this," Tom said, showing me his profile on his phone. The police had started sharing relevant documents with affected residents. "She's got me labeled as high risk, resistant to security protocols, because I refused to give her a copy of my house key." The cybersecurity expert confirmed that Margaret had attempted to access various neighbors' Wi-Fi networks, presumably to gather more data. She had detailed notes about which homes had security cameras, smart doorbells, or other surveillance equipment that might interfere with her own monitoring systems. As night fell, the police finally finished loading the last of the evidence into their vehicles. The technical team had removed over 40 hidden cameras, 5 servers' worth of stored footage, and boxes of written records. They'd also discovered Margaret had created fake emergency response credentials, complete with official-looking badges and uniforms. Richard called me over as the police were leaving. "The board's insurance company is sending their own investigators tomorrow," he said, looking exhausted. "They're concerned about potential lawsuits from residents whose privacy was violated. This could end up being one of the largest HOA insurance claims in state history." Looking around at my neighbors' worried faces illuminated by the departing police lights, I realized this was just the beginning. Margaret's obsession with emergency preparedness had ironically created a real emergency, one that would take months, if not years, to fully unravel. The next morning brought a new wave of revelations. The insurance company's investigators arrived early, setting up a temporary office in the community center. They brought in their own tech experts to assess the extent of Margaret's surveillance network and its potential liability implications for the HOA. While they worked, Officer Rodriguez called to share some concerning news. The investigation had expanded beyond our neighborhood after they discovered Margaret had created detailed files on emergency services personnel throughout Portland. She had surveillance photos of fire stations, police precincts, even ambulance routes, he explained. We found maps marking what she called emergency response deficiencies in official protocols. She was planning to implement her own emergency response system that would correct these perceived failures. The scope of Margaret's obsession was staggering. She hadn't just been watching our neighborhood. She'd been building her own shadow emergency management system. The police found evidence that she'd been attending city council meetings, taking detailed notes about emergency service budget discussions and personnel changes. More disturbing were her plans for what she called Phase 3 implementation. In her documents, she outlined a strategy to gradually take control of actual emergency responses in our area. She had even ordered emergency vehicle light bars and sirens, planning to outfit her SUV as an emergency response coordination vehicle. The really concerning part, Officer Rodriguez continued, is that we found communication attempts with various emergency services suppliers. She tried to order official-looking uniforms and equipment using fake credentials. Some companies actually started the approval process before catching the discrepancies. Around noon, the HOA's attorney called an emergency meeting with the board and several key witnesses, including me. The insurance investigators had found something in Margaret's files that changed the entire scope of the situation. She wasn't just planning to monitor emergencies, the attorney explained, spreading documents across the conference table. She was planning to create them. We found detailed plans for staging what she called emergency readiness scenarios throughout the neighborhood. The plans were meticulously detailed. Margaret had mapped out various scenarios she intended to orchestrate: water main breaks, power outages, even small fires, all designed to test her emergency protocols. She had already purchased some of the equipment needed to create these artificial emergencies. "Look at this supply list," Richard said, holding up a receipt. She bought remote-controlled smoke generators, water pressure reduction valves, and electrical circuit interrupters. She was literally planning to engineer emergencies to justify her position. The insurance investigators had also discovered something that sent chills down everyone's spines. Margaret had created detailed profiles of residents she considered emergency risks, people whose normal activities might interfere with her protocols. She had plans to systematically drive these residents out of the neighborhood through manufactured emergencies and targeted harassment. Sarah, who was at the meeting because of her medical background, found her own name on the list. She marked me as a high-priority removal target because my night shifts disrupted neighborhood security patterns, she read, her hands shaking. She was planning to make my house uninhabitable through a series of unfortunate incidents. The attorney was particularly concerned about a folder labeled Phase 3 compliance measures. Inside were detailed plans for using the surveillance system to gather compromising information on residents who resisted her emergency protocols. Margaret had actually started collecting what she considered leverage, embarrassing or private moments caught on her cameras. "This goes way beyond HOA overreach," the attorney stated grimly. "We're looking at potential criminal conspiracy charges. She wasn't just planning to violate people's privacy. She was planning to use that information to coerce compliance with her emergency protocols." As the meeting continued, we received word that the police had expanded their search to Margaret's workplace and her storage unit across town. They'd found more surveillance equipment and documents, suggesting that Willow Creek Estates wasn't her only target. She had similar files on 3 other neighborhoods, Officer Bennett reported by phone. She was planning to expand her emergency response network across the entire northeast section of Portland. We found grant applications she'd written trying to get funding for what she called a community emergency response integration system. The implications were becoming clear. Margaret's obsession with emergency preparedness wasn't just a local nuisance. She'd been building an elaborate network of surveillance and control, planning to gradually expand her influence beyond our neighborhood. What had started as a simple dispute over parking had uncovered something far more sinister. The situation took an unexpected turn when local media got hold of Margaret's grant applications. A reporter from the Portland Tribune had discovered that Margaret had actually managed to secure a small $5,000 grant from a community safety organization. She had used her fake credentials and elaborate presentations about her emergency response protocols to convince them she was developing a legitimate neighborhood safety program. "We've got reporters asking for statements," Richard said during an emergency board meeting that evening. "The organization that gave her the grant is in damage control mode. They're worried about other potential fraudulent applications she might have submitted under different names." The HOA's attorney had brought in a crisis management specialist to help handle the growing media attention. Camera crews had been parked at the neighborhood entrance all day, trying to get interviews with residents about Margaret's surveillance system. "The problem isn't just the surveillance," the specialist explained. "It's the fact that she was using legitimate community safety concerns to build what amounts to a private intelligence operation. This is the kind of story that could go national." She wasn't wrong. By mid-afternoon, several national news outlets had picked up the story. HOA, Emergency Coordinator's Secret Surveillance Empire, read one headline. Neighborhood Watch Gone Wrong. The Shadow Security State in Suburban Portland, read another. The police investigation had also uncovered something that made the story even more newsworthy. In Margaret's files, they found evidence that she had attempted to hack into the city's emergency alert system. She had detailed plans to send out fake emergency notifications to test community response times. "She actually managed to access some lower-level systems," Officer Rodriguez explained, showing us the technical report. "She was planning to trigger false emergency alerts in specific neighborhoods to document evacuation patterns. If she hadn't been caught, she could have caused widespread panic." The revelation about the attempted system hack brought in federal investigators. 2 FBI agents arrived to review Margaret's computer systems, particularly interested in her attempts to access government emergency networks. "This isn't just about neighborhood surveillance anymore," Agent Parker told us during a briefing. "We're looking at potential federal crimes related to attempted access of emergency management systems. Ms. Wellington's actions could have had serious consequences for public safety." Meanwhile, the community was dealing with the psychological impact of discovering just how extensively they'd been watched. The HOA had hired a security company to do sweeps of everyone's properties, looking for any remaining surveillance equipment. They kept finding new cameras and listening devices in unexpected places. "Found another one in the pool area," Tom reported, holding up what looked like a regular clock. "She had it rigged to record conversations around the pool deck. The technical guys say it could pick up conversations from over 30 feet away." Mrs. Chen had organized a community support group to help residents deal with the stress of the situation. People were struggling with feeling violated, knowing that their private moments had been recorded and analyzed for years. "She had footage of my grandson learning to swim," Mrs. Chen said during one of the group meetings. She made notes about his progress, commenting on whether his swimming skills would be adequate for emergency situations. Who thinks like that about a 6-year-old? The FBI's cybercrime unit made another disturbing discovery. Margaret had been attempting to create profiles of residents' online activities by monitoring internet traffic through compromised Wi-Fi networks. She had detailed notes about online shopping patterns, social media usage, and even banking activities. She was trying to build complete digital profiles of everyone in the neighborhood, Agent Parker explained. The surveillance cameras were just one part of a larger intelligence-gathering operation. She wanted to know everything about everyone. Sarah found evidence that Margaret had been tracking her medical credentials and hospital access codes. She had my entire work schedule mapped out, including which hospital entrances I used and what time I took breaks. She was planning to use my medical access as part of her emergency response network. The HOA's insurance company was now facing the possibility of multiple lawsuits. Residents were talking about filing a class action suit over the privacy violations. The insurance investigators estimated that the potential liability could run into millions of dollars. "Every day we find something new," Richard said, looking exhausted after another long meeting. "Just when we think we've uncovered the full extent of her activities, another layer emerges. How did we not see this happening right under our noses?" The answer, ironically, lay in Margaret's own psychological evaluation, which the police had obtained as part of their investigation. She had been so effective at hiding her activities precisely because she had wrapped everything in a veneer of legitimate community safety concerns. Who wants to question someone who seems dedicated to keeping their neighborhood safe? While the investigation continued to uncover new layers of Margaret's surveillance operation, we finally got word about Margaret herself. She had been released on bail, but was required to wear an ankle monitor and stay at least 500 feet away from Willow Creek Estates. The irony of her being the one under surveillance now wasn't lost on anyone. Her lawyer had released a statement claiming that everything Margaret did was in the interest of public safety, and that she was being persecuted for taking community emergency preparedness seriously. The statement painted her as a dedicated community servant who had perhaps been overzealous, but had no malicious intent. That narrative fell apart quickly when the FBI revealed what they'd found in her storage unit across town. Beyond the surveillance equipment, they discovered what appeared to be a fully equipped emergency command center in waiting. She had purchased authentic-looking emergency response uniforms, professional-grade radio equipment, and even a light bar and siren system for her car. She was literally planning to create her own emergency response force, Agent Parker explained during a community briefing. "We found applications for security guard licenses under various names, along with falsified credentials and certificates. She was building an entire fictional emergency response organization. The most disturbing discovery was a detailed timeline for what she called the implementation. Starting with our neighborhood, she planned to gradually expand her influence by manufacturing various emergency situations that would demonstrate the inadequacy of current emergency response systems. "Look at this," Officer Rodriguez said, showing us a calendar found in her command center. She had scheduled a series of infrastructure failures, power outages, water main breaks, traffic light malfunctions. Each incident was designed to create chaos that she would then efficiently manage with her own response team. Margaret's daughter had stopped defending her mother on social media and was now cooperating with investigators. She revealed that Margaret had been stockpiling emergency supplies and equipment for years, gradually building her surveillance network while maintaining a facade of normal community involvement. "Mom always was intense about safety," her daughter told the investigators. "But after she retired from teaching, it became an obsession. She started seeing potential emergencies everywhere. She convinced herself that only she could protect people from disasters that might happen." The psychological evaluation ordered by the court painted a picture of someone who had developed an increasingly paranoid worldview. Margaret had convinced herself that traditional emergency services were inadequate and that she needed to step in to save her community, whether they wanted it or not. Meanwhile, the insurance investigators had made a breakthrough in understanding how Margaret had funded her operation. Beyond the fraudulent grant, she had been running a sophisticated scheme involving fake emergency preparedness consulting services. She had created a shell company that supposedly provided community safety audits and used it to bill various organizations for her expertise. She was actually making money from this, the lead investigator explained. She'd approach community organizations, homeowners associations, even small businesses, offering to evaluate their emergency preparedness. Then she'd use that access to gather information and install surveillance equipment. The FBI had traced payments from several other neighborhoods in the Portland area. Margaret had been conducting safety audits for at least 5 other communities, using her false credentials and manufactured experience to convince them of her expertise. Each audit was essentially a reconnaissance mission, Agent Parker said. She'd map out camera locations, identify potential command center sites, and gather personal information about residents. She was building a database of potential expansion targets. The investigation also revealed that Margaret had been approaching local emergency services personnel, attempting to recruit them into what she called her enhanced response network. She had detailed files on various firefighters, EMTs, and police officers, including personal information she planned to use to pressure them into cooperating with her plans. She was looking for anyone who might be dissatisfied with current emergency response protocols, Officer Rodriguez explained. She'd approach them with promises of being part of something more efficient and more responsive than traditional services. As the evidence mounted, Margaret's lawyer attempted to negotiate a plea deal. The initial offer was quickly rejected by prosecutors who were now dealing with multiple jurisdictions wanting to press charges. Between the surveillance, fraud, attempted system hacking, and planned infrastructure tampering, Margaret was facing a significant number of serious charges. The real question now, Richard said during yet another community meeting, is how do we make sure something like this can never happen again? How did one person manage to build this kind of surveillance operation right under our noses? The answer we were learning lay in how easily people can exploit our trust when they wrap their actions in the language of safety and security. Margaret had used our natural desire to feel protected to create something that ultimately made everyone less safe. The investigation took an unexpected turn when the FBI's forensic team discovered encrypted files on Margaret's main server. After breaking the encryption, they found what she called her contingency protocols, detailed plans for what to do if her surveillance operation was ever discovered. She had dirt on everyone, Agent Parker explained during a private briefing with the HOA board and key witnesses. Not just general surveillance, but specifically curated moments she thought she could use as leverage. She was saving it all as insurance. The discovery led to a delicate situation. The FBI had to inform certain residents about potentially compromising footage while trying to maintain their privacy. They set up private meetings in the community center where people could review what Margaret had collected about them and decide whether to press additional charges. Sarah was one of the first to be called in. She emerged from her meeting looking pale. She had footage of me having a private conversation with a patient's family in my front yard, she explained later. She had it tagged as potential HIPAA violation. She was planning to threaten my medical license if I ever opposed her emergency protocols. Tom found out she had recordings of every argument he'd ever had with his girlfriend in his driveway. She noted which topics made us most upset, he said, showing me his file. She was planning to use our relationship struggles to manipulate us into compliance with her programs. The psychological impact on the community deepened as more residents learned what Margaret had collected about them. The HOA had to hire a trauma counselor to help people process the violations of their privacy. Group therapy sessions were scheduled 3 times a week in the community center. It's not just about what she recorded, Mrs. Chen explained during one session. It's knowing that every private moment, every personal conversation in our own yards was being watched and analyzed. She turned our homes into her personal surveillance experiment. Meanwhile, the investigation into Margaret's former workplace revealed she had been practicing her surveillance techniques long before moving to our neighborhood. As a high school vice principal, she had installed unauthorized cameras in the school, claiming they were for student safety. "We found records going back 15 years, Officer Rodriguez shared. She started small, a few cameras in the hallways, but it escalated to monitoring teacher lounges, parking lots, even trying to install devices in staff offices. She resigned when the school board started asking questions. The pattern was clear. Margaret had been perfecting her surveillance techniques for years, always using safety and emergency preparedness as her justification. Each time she was discovered, she would simply move on and start again, becoming more sophisticated in her methods. The FBI's cyber team made another discovery that sent ripples through the investigation. Margaret had been participating in online forums dedicated to surveillance technology and emergency response systems. But she wasn't just learning. She had been teaching others her methods. She was actually running training sessions, Agent Parker revealed, teaching people how to create what she called autonomous safety networks in their own communities. We're now investigating several other cases across the country that match her methodology. The revelation that Margaret might have inspired copycat surveillance operations led to a broader federal investigation. The FBI began reaching out to other communities where similar patterns had been reported, looking for connections to Margaret's online activities. Local emergency services were also dealing with the fallout. Margaret had apparently been showing up at fire stations and police precincts, attempting to integrate herself into their operations. She had created fake credentials so convincing that she had been allowed to sit in on several emergency response planning meetings. She took detailed notes about our protocols, a fire chief admitted during a press conference. "We thought she was a legitimate emergency management consultant. She used that information to make her own operations seem more authentic." The Portland Emergency Management Office had to review years of meetings and training sessions, trying to determine how much sensitive information Margaret had accessed. They found she had attended numerous disaster preparedness workshops, always presenting herself as a community safety expert. "She built her credibility layer by layer," Richard observed during a board meeting. "Each successful infiltration gave her more legitimacy for the next one. She created a whole fictional career in emergency management, and we all believed it because she seemed so dedicated." As the investigation continued to expand, residents struggled to rebuild their sense of security. Security companies were doing brisk business installing new alarm systems and cameras, ones that residents could actually control. The irony of fighting surveillance with surveillance wasn't lost on anyone, but people needed to feel safe in their own homes again. The community's lawyers called an emergency meeting to discuss a disturbing development. Margaret's attorney had made an unusual proposal. She would provide information about other surveillance networks she had helped establish in exchange for a reduced sentence. "She's trying to leverage her connections to other surveillance operations," our attorney explained. "According to her lawyer, she has information about at least 12 other communities where similar systems have been implemented." The FBI was interested in the offer, but residents had mixed feelings. On one hand, stopping other surveillance operations seemed important. On the other hand, the idea of Margaret getting a lighter sentence because she had taught others her methods felt wrong. "She shouldn't be rewarded for spreading this surveillance cancer to other communities," Tom argued during the meeting. "She's basically admitting she created a network of privacy violators, and now she wants to use that as a bargaining chip." The debate became moot when the FBI's forensic team made another breakthrough. They'd recovered deleted emails showing Margaret had actually been selling her surveillance footage to private investigation firms. She had marketed it as pre-vetted intelligence about residential neighborhoods. This wasn't just about emergency preparedness, Agent Parker announced. She was running a commercial surveillance operation, selling people's private moments to the highest bidder. The emergency response angle was just a cover. The discovery of the commercial aspect changed everything. What had started as a case about unauthorized surveillance and fake emergency protocols was now a full-blown criminal enterprise investigation. The FBI expanded their task force, bringing in specialists in financial crimes. We've traced payments from 3 different PI firms, the financial investigator reported. She was making upwards of $10,000 a month selling surveillance footage. The emergency preparedness consulting was just a side business to gain access to more communities. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was dealing with an unexpected problem. Real estate agents reported that homes in Willow Creek Estates had become nearly impossible to sell. The community's name had become synonymous with the surveillance scandal, and potential buyers were staying away. We've had 6 sales fall through this month, our local realtor explained during a community meeting. As soon as buyers Google the neighborhood, they find all the news stories about Margaret's surveillance network. Nobody wants to live in that neighborhood with the crazy emergency lady. The HOA board hired a PR firm to help manage the community's reputation, but the damage was significant. They had to create a detailed document explaining all the new security measures and privacy protections that had been implemented since Margaret's arrest. We're actually one of the most privacy-conscious communities now, Richard pointed out. Every camera is documented, every security measure is transparent, and residents have full access to all surveillance logs. We learned our lesson the hard way. The stress was taking its toll on everyone. The community therapist reported increasing anxiety levels among residents. People were having trouble sleeping, jumping at unexpected noises, and feeling paranoid about being watched even though all of Margaret's equipment had been removed. We're seeing classic symptoms of privacy violation trauma, the therapist explained. People feel violated not just in their physical space, but in their sense of personal security. Rebuilding that trust takes time. Mrs. Chen organized a community healing event, turning the monthly potluck into a Reclaim Our Space celebration. Residents gathered in the community center, sharing stories and supporting each other. The walls were decorated with positive messages and affirmations about privacy and security. We need to take back our narrative, Mrs. Chen declared. We're not victims of surveillance anymore. We're survivors who exposed a criminal operation and made our community stronger. The FBI's investigation continued to uncover new details about Margaret's operation. They found evidence that she had been planning to expand into corporate surveillance, targeting small businesses and office complexes with her emergency preparedness consulting scheme. She had proposals ready for 3 different business parks, Agent Parker shared. Same approach: offer emergency response consulting, install surveillance equipment, gather information, and then sell it to interested parties. She was building a commercial espionage operation under the guise of public safety. The revelation led to increased scrutiny of emergency preparedness consultants nationwide. Professional organizations began implementing stricter verification procedures, and communities became more cautious about who they allowed to conduct safety audits. As one resident put it during a community meeting, Margaret didn't just violate our privacy, she poisoned the well of legitimate emergency preparedness efforts. Now everyone who actually wants to help make communities safer has to fight against her legacy of suspicion. The district attorney's office called a meeting with the residents to discuss the upcoming legal proceedings. Margaret was facing multiple federal charges, and prosecutors wanted to ensure everyone understood their role in the case. We've identified at least 37 distinct criminal charges, the lead prosecutor explained. Everything from wire fraud to unauthorized surveillance to interstate commerce violations. But we need your testimony to make these charges stick. The prospect of testifying was daunting for many residents. Margaret's extensive documentation of their private lives made them hesitant to appear in court, worried that intimate details might become public record. I understand your concerns, the prosecutor assured us. We've filed motions to seal sensitive evidence. Your privacy has been violated enough. We won't let the trial become another invasion. Meanwhile, the FBI's investigation into Margaret's finances revealed something unexpected. She had been investing her surveillance profits into developing what she called next-generation emergency response technology. They found prototype designs for sophisticated monitoring devices disguised as everyday objects. She was working with a small electronics manufacturer in Taiwan, Agent Parker reported. Custom-designed surveillance equipment that looked like normal household items, light fixtures, smoke detectors, even garden ornaments. She was planning to mass-produce these devices. The prototypes were ingenious and terrifying. One looked like a standard doorbell camera, but could actually intercept Wi-Fi signals from nearby homes. Another, disguised as a solar-powered garden light, contained a directional microphone that could pick up conversations through windows. We found purchase orders for an initial production run of 5,000 units, the agent continued. She was preparing to supply her network of fellow surveillance enthusiasts with undetectable monitoring equipment. The discovery led to a nationwide alert about suspicious emergency preparedness consultants. Several other communities reported individuals using similar tactics to gain access and install unauthorized surveillance equipment. Margaret created a blueprint for privacy invasion, Officer Rodriguez noted during a community update. She showed others how to exploit people's natural desire for safety and security. We're seeing copycat operations across the country. The media attention intensified when journalists discovered Margaret had been keeping detailed records of her students' private lives during her time as a vice principal. Former students came forward with stories about how she had used surveillance or footage to manipulate and control them. She would call us into her office and somehow know everything we'd done, one former student told reporters. Who we talked to, what we said, even things that happened off school grounds. Now we know she had cameras and microphones everywhere. The school district where she had worked launched its own investigation, bringing in security experts to sweep for any remaining surveillance equipment. They found several devices that had been operating undetected for years, still sending data to one of Margaret's backup servers. Back in our neighborhood, the HOA board was dealing with insurance complications. The insurance company was threatening to cancel our policy, claiming that Margaret's actions represented an undisclosed risk. They are arguing that the HOA should have known about her surveillance activities, Richard explained during an emergency board meeting. They're saying our failure to detect and stop her constitutes negligence. The board's attorney argued that we were victims, not negligent parties, but the insurance company remained firm. They would only continue coverage if we implemented an extensive list of security measures and oversight protocols. Basically, they want us to create a surveillance system to prevent surveillance, Tom said sarcastically during the meeting. How do we protect privacy by monitoring everything? The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The community had to find a balance between security and privacy, all while trying to recover from the trauma of Margaret's invasive monitoring. Mrs. Chen's son, the fire chief, helped develop a reasonable compromise. The neighborhood would install a limited number of security cameras in public areas only, with strict protocols for accessing the footage. A resident oversight committee would monitor the system, ensuring complete transparency. The difference, he explained, is that this time the community controls the cameras. Everything is documented, every access is logged, and no one person has unlimited power. As these changes were being implemented, Margaret's lawyer made another attempt at a plea deal. This time she offered to reveal the locations of all her backup servers and surveillance equipment in exchange for a reduced sentence. She claims there are still active devices we haven't found, Agent Parker told us. She's trying to use our desire for closure as leverage, just like she used our desire for safety to install the surveillance in the first place. The community's response was unanimous. We wouldn't be manipulated again. If there were more devices, we would find them ourselves. Margaret had played on our fears once. We wouldn't let her do it again. As the trial date approached, the prosecution team organized preparation sessions for residents who would be testifying. They converted the community center into a mock courtroom, helping witnesses get comfortable with sharing their experiences while maintaining their composure. Margaret's defense team will try to paint her actions as well-intentioned community service, the lead prosecutor warned. They'll suggest that any privacy violations were accidental, byproducts of legitimate emergency preparedness efforts. We need your testimony to show the calculated nature of her surveillance operation. The defense's strategy became clear when they filed their preliminary motions. They planned to argue that Margaret suffered from a psychiatric condition that made her obsessed with community safety. They had expert witnesses prepared to testify about hypervigilance disorder and community protection complex. They're trying to medicalize criminal behavior, our attorney explained during a briefing. If they can convince the jury that Margaret's actions were driven by mental illness rather than criminal intent, they might get the charges reduced or even dismissed on mental health grounds. The FBI's continued investigation complicated the defense's strategy, however. They discovered that Margaret had maintained detailed financial records of her surveillance operation, including profit projections and market analysis for her custom surveillance equipment business. These aren't the actions of someone disconnected from reality, Agent Parker pointed out, showing us spreadsheets found on Margaret's computer. She calculated return on investment for each surveillance device, tracked revenue from footage sales, and planned marketing strategies for her security consulting services. This was a business, not a delusion. The investigation also uncovered connections to a larger network of privacy violators. Margaret had been part of an online community that traded surveillance techniques and footage. They called themselves community safety advocates, but essentially functioned as a black market for private information. We've identified members in 15 different states, Officer Rodriguez reported. They share equipment suppliers, trading strategies, and even customer lists for selling surveillance footage. Margaret wasn't just a participant. She was one of their top contributors. The scope of the operation became even clearer when the FBI traced the money. Margaret had set up offshore accounts to handle payments for her surveillance footage, using a complex system of shell companies to hide the transactions. She had nearly $800,000 stored in accounts across 3 different countries, the financial crimes investigator revealed, all from selling footage and consulting services. This wasn't about emergency preparedness, it was about profit. Meanwhile, our community was dealing with an unexpected side effect of the case. Privacy rights organizations had begun using Willow Creek Estates as a case study in community surveillance abuse. We were receiving requests for interviews and documentary appearances almost daily. They want to use our experience to warn other communities, Richard explained during a board meeting. The question is, do we want to become the poster child for privacy rights, or do we try to move past this and rebuild our reputation quietly? The debate divided residents. Some felt we had a responsibility to share our story and prevent other communities from falling victim to similar schemes. Others wanted to avoid more publicity, hoping to put the whole incident behind us. Mrs. Chen offered a compromise that seemed to satisfy everyone. "We create a detailed record of what happened and how we recovered," she suggested. "Make it available to communities that need it, but don't actively seek publicity. Let our experience help others without turning our neighborhood into a spectacle." The preparation for trial revealed more about how Margaret had manipulated community trust. She had deliberately targeted certain residents for more intensive surveillance, particularly those she identified as potential threats to her operation. "She had a ranking system," Tom explained, showing me his file. "The more likely you were to question her authority or notice her surveillance, the more closely she watched you. She called it risk management, but it was really about control." The prosecutors were particularly interested in evidence showing how Margaret had used her surveillance to manipulate HOA board elections. She had gathered compromising information about potential candidates who might oppose her emergency protocols, using it to discourage them from running. "She effectively rigged our community governance," Richard admitted during a preparation session. "Anyone who might have spotted her activities was either pushed out or scared into silence. She created a perfect environment for her operation to flourish." As the trial date grew closer, residents began receiving subpoenas. The prosecution had built their case carefully, planning to show the progression from Margaret's initial emergency protocols to her full-blown surveillance enterprise. Each witness would illustrate a different aspect of her systematic violation of community trust. The first day of trial brought unexpected drama. As residents arrived at the courthouse, we discovered that Margaret's surveillance network extended even further than we'd imagined. The FBI had found evidence that she had been monitoring the courthouse itself in the weeks leading up to her arrest, apparently gathering intelligence about security patterns and staff routines. She had detailed logs of judge schedules, security, shift changes, even courthouse cleaning crew routines, Agent Parker briefed us before the proceedings began. "We believe she was planning to install her own surveillance equipment in the judicial complex under the guise of a security consultation." The revelation prompted an immediate security sweep of the courthouse and delayed the start of proceedings. When we finally entered the courtroom, Margaret sat at the defense table, looking considerably different from the self-appointed emergency coordinator we'd known. Gone was the pseudo-official uniform and emergency response lanyard, replaced by a conservative business suit and reading glasses. The prosecutor's opening statement painted a damning picture. Using a detailed timeline, she showed how Margaret had systematically built her surveillance empire, starting with simple security cameras and escalating to sophisticated audio monitoring and data collection. "This isn't about emergency preparedness," the prosecutor declared. "The defendant created an elaborate fiction about community safety to mask a criminal enterprise. She didn't just violate privacy, she commodified it, turning her neighbors' private moments into a product she could sell." Margaret's defense team tried to counter with their mental health narrative, but their strategy hit an unexpected snag. The prosecution had obtained emails between Margaret and her surveillance equipment suppliers in Taiwan, showing detailed negotiations about pricing and technical specifications. "These are not the actions of someone disconnected from reality," the prosecutor pointed out. "The defendant methodically sourced equipment, haggled over prices, and calculated profit margins. She knew exactly what she was doing." During the first break, we gathered in the witness waiting room, where the FBI shared another discovery. They'd found Margaret's personal journal, which detailed her long-term plans for expanding her surveillance operation nationally. "She had a 5-year business plan," Agent Parker explained, showing us copies of the relevant pages. "She was planning to franchise her emergency response consulting model, training others to infiltrate communities and install surveillance networks. She even had marketing materials designed." The journal entries were chilling in their calculated approach. Margaret had identified target communities based on factors like average home value, HOA structure, and resident demographics. She had even created profiles of ideal franchise operators, people she could train to replicate her surveillance scheme in other neighborhoods. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution began presenting evidence about Margaret's financial operation. A forensic accountant testified about the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts she had created to handle payments for surveillance footage. The defendant maintained meticulous records of every transaction, the accountant testified. Each piece of footage was catalogued, priced, and tracked. She even had a rating system for determining the market value of different types of surveillance data. During cross-examination, Margaret's defense team tried to suggest that the financial records were actually part of her emergency preparedness documentation. But the argument fell flat when the prosecution produced emails between Margaret and various private investigation firms discussing pricing for different types of surveillance footage. Looking for dirt on your neighbor's teenager? That's $500. The prosecutor read from one email. Want to know about your employees' off-work activities? That's $1,000 per week of surveillance. The defendant turned privacy violation into a menu of services. The afternoon brought testimony from a cybersecurity expert who had analyzed Margaret's surveillance software. He revealed that she had developed a sophisticated system for automatically identifying and flagging marketable moments in the surveillance footage. The software would scan for arguments, unusual behavior, or anything that deviated from normal patterns, he explained. It would then catalog these moments and assign them potential market values based on their content. This was essentially an automated privacy violation factory. By the end of the first day, even Margaret's most ardent defenders in the community had fallen silent. The evidence painted a picture not of an overzealous safety advocate, but of a calculating entrepreneur who had built a business around violating people's privacy. As we left the courthouse, Mrs. Chen summed up what many of us were feeling. We thought she was crazy, but that almost would have been better. This wasn't madness. It was pure greed, hidden behind a mask of community service. The second day of trial brought forward testimony from technical experts who had analyzed Margaret's surveillance equipment. Their findings revealed an even more sophisticated operation than initially suspected. The cameras she had installed weren't just recording devices. They were part of an AI-powered analysis system. The defendant had implemented facial recognition and behavior analysis software, the technical expert testified. The system could identify residents, track their patterns, and flag any deviations from their normal routines. It would automatically generate alerts when it detected what it classified as marketable behavior. During cross-examination, Margaret's defense team tried to argue that the AI system was designed for emergency response optimization, but their argument collapsed when the prosecution produced Margaret's marketing materials for private investigators. Premium package, real-time behavior monitoring with instant alerts, the prosecutor read from a glossy brochure. Know immediately when your target deviates from established patterns. Includes access to our proprietary prediction algorithm for anticipating subject movements. The afternoon session focused on Margaret's attempts to expand her operation into other communities. The FBI had recovered emails between Margaret and several other self-styled emergency coordinators in different states. She had been coaching them on how to replicate her surveillance system. Think of yourself as a security consultant first, one email advised. Emergency response is just the cover story. The real money is in the data collection. Start small with a few cameras, build trust, then expand. Remember, people will accept almost anything if you convince them it's for their safety. The prosecution then called an unexpected witness, one of Margaret's surveillance equipment suppliers from Taiwan. He testified via video link about their business relationship, revealing that Margaret had commissioned increasingly sophisticated monitoring devices. She wanted cameras that could capture conversations through windows using laser microphones. He testified. She asked for devices that could intercept Wi-Fi signals and cell phone data. These were not standard security products. They were professional-grade surveillance tools. The supplier's testimony dealt another blow to Margaret's mental health defense. Their email exchanges showed her haggling over prices, discussing technical specifications, and planning future product development. These were not the actions of someone disconnected from reality. During the lunch break, Agent Parker shared another discovery with the residents waiting to testify. The FBI had found Margaret's customer database, revealing that she had been selling surveillance footage to more than just private investigators. She had corporate clients, he explained, companies wanting to monitor employee behavior outside work, insurance companies looking for evidence to deny claims, even talent agencies tracking their clients. She had turned privacy violation into a full-service business. When court resumed, the prosecution focused on Margaret's attempts to manipulate local government. They presented evidence that she had used her surveillance footage to influence city council members and local officials. The defendant maintained files on key decision-makers, the prosecutor explained. When she needed permits approved or inspections overlooked, she would mysteriously know exactly which officials to approach and what leverage to use. A former city clerk testified about how Margaret had approached her with surveillance footage of her teenage son smoking behind the school. The implied threat was clear: either help approve her emergency response consulting contracts, or the footage would find its way to school administrators. The day's most dramatic moment came when the prosecution played audio recordings from Margaret's own security system. She had inadvertently recorded herself discussing pricing strategies with a private investigator client. "Trust me, people will pay premium rates for the right kind of footage," Margaret's voice said clearly in the recording. "Everyone has secrets, and secrets are valuable. We're not just selling surveillance. We're selling power over people's lives." The recording stunned the courtroom into silence. Even Margaret's defense team seemed caught off guard. Their client's own words had confirmed what the prosecution had been arguing. This was never about community safety. As the day concluded, the prosecution announced they had recovered even more surveillance footage from Margaret's backup servers. They would need time to process it all, but preliminary analysis suggested she had been recording residents for longer than initially thought. "We found archived footage dating back 5 years, Agent Parker told us as we left the courthouse. Before she even moved to the neighborhood, she had been planning this operation for much longer than anyone realized. The revelation sent a chill through the community members present. How long had Margaret been watching us? How many other communities had she targeted before settling on Willow Creek Estates? The answers, it seemed, were still emerging. The third day of trial began with an unexpected development. The prosecution announced they had discovered a hidden data center in a storage facility 2 towns over. Margaret had maintained a complete backup of all her surveillance operations there, running on a sophisticated server setup powered by industrial-grade generators. The defendant wasn't just collecting data, she was ensuring it would survive any attempt to shut down her operation, the prosecutor explained. This facility was designed to maintain surveillance records even if her primary systems were discovered and seized. A digital forensics expert testified about the backup facility's contents. The servers contained not just surveillance footage, but detailed analytics about residents' behaviors, relationships, and daily patterns. Margaret had created what amounted to a searchable database of private lives. Want to know who visited a particular house in the last 6 months? The system could tell you, the expert demonstrated. Looking for everyone who argued with their Spouse in public? It could generate that list. The defendant had essentially created Google Maps for privacy violations. During cross-examination, Margaret's defense team tried to argue that the backup facility was part of standard emergency preparedness protocols. That strategy backfired when the prosecution produced maintenance logs showing regular data transfers to various private investigation firms and corporate clients. These weren't emergency backup servers, the prosecutor pointed out. They were distribution centers for a commercial surveillance product. The defendant was running a data warehouse for privacy violations. The afternoon brought testimony from one of Margaret's former clients, a private investigator who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. He described how Margaret's surveillance network had become a valuable resource in his industry. She could provide information no other source could match, he testified. Want to know someone's daily routine, their visitors, their private conversations? She had it all. Perfectly organized and searchable, it was like having a spy network without the risk of getting caught. The PI's testimony revealed that Margaret had been developing specialized surveillance packages for different types of clients. Insurance companies could monitor claimants' activities. Employers could track workers' off-duty behavior. Divorce attorneys could gather evidence about their clients' spouses. She called it targeted intelligence gathering, he explained, but really it was just industrialized privacy violation. She had turned neighborhood surveillance into a subscription service. During a break-in proceedings, Agent Parker shared another disturbing discovery with the waiting residents. The FBI had found evidence that Margaret had been developing a mobile surveillance platform, essentially a van equipped with advanced monitoring equipment. She was planning to expand beyond fixed locations, he explained. The van would have allowed her to follow targets, gather data on the move, and extend her surveillance network into new areas. She had already ordered most of the equipment. When court resumed, the prosecution focused on Margaret's attempts to franchise her operation. They presented a complete business plan found on her backup servers, detailing how she planned to recruit and train other emergency coordinators across the country. The defendant created a complete training program, the prosecutor explained, how to infiltrate communities, how to gain trust, how to install surveillance equipment without detection. She was planning to create a national network of privacy violators, all operating under the cover of emergency preparedness. The training materials were chillingly detailed. Margaret had created step-by-step guides for identifying vulnerable communities, manipulating HOA boards, and gradually expanding surveillance coverage. She even included scripts for handling resident complaints and deflecting suspicion. Remember, safety is your shield, one training document advised. People will accept almost any invasion of privacy if you convince them it's for their protection. Use fear to your advantage. Create problems you can solve. Late in the day, the prosecution introduced evidence about Margaret's attempts to expand into corporate surveillance. They found proposals she had prepared for several major companies, offering to monitor employee behavior both at work and at home. The defendant was positioning herself as a corporate intelligence provider, the prosecutor explained. She planned to use her residential surveillance network as a proof of concept for larger commercial operations. This was just the beginning of what she hoped would become a surveillance empire. The day ended with testimony from a cybersecurity expert who had analyzed Margaret's client communication system. She had created an encrypted platform for sharing surveillance data with her customers, complete with a rating system for different types of information. Personal conversations were priced highest, he testified, followed by evidence of relationships, daily routines, and unusual behavior. The defendant had essentially created a menu of privacy violations, with prices varying based on how intimate or potentially damaging the information was. The fourth day of trial brought the most dramatic testimony yet. The prosecution called Margaret's former IT specialist, who had agreed to testify in exchange for reduced charges in his own case. His revelations about the true scope of her operation left the courtroom in stunned silence. It wasn't just about surveillance, he testified. Ms. Wellington was building a predictive behavior system. The AI didn't just track what people were doing. It predicted what they might do next. She was selling future intelligence to her clients. The IT specialist demonstrated how Margaret's system would analyze patterns in residents' behavior to predict everything from potential divorces to career changes. She had been marketing these predictions to insurance companies, employers, and private investigators as preemptive intelligence. Let's say someone in the neighborhood was having marriage problems, he explained. The system would analyze their behavior patterns, communications, and daily routines. Then it would calculate the probability of various outcomes: separation, affair, reconciliation. Clients would pay premium rates for these predictions. During cross-examination, the defense tried to discredit his testimony by suggesting he was the real architect of the surveillance system. This backfired when the prosecution produced emails showing Margaret had personally designed many of the system's features, including the prediction algorithms. Ms. Wellington was extremely specific about what she wanted the system to track. The IT specialist continued. She had categories for everything: financial stress indicators, relationship status changes, health issues. She called it life pattern analysis, but it was really just automated privacy invasion. The afternoon session revealed another shocking aspect of Margaret's operation. The FBI had discovered she was developing what she called intervention protocols, plans to actively influence the events her system predicted. If the system predicted a divorce was likely, Agent Parker explained to the court, she would strategically release certain surveillance footage to either precipitate or prevent it, depending on what her clients wanted. She wasn't just observing life events, she was trying to control them. The prosecution produced a document titled Outcome Optimization Strategies, which detailed how Margaret planned to use her surveillance data to manipulate various situations. She had created detailed flowcharts showing how different types of information could be used to influence people's decisions. Consider this example, the prosecutor highlighted. If her system predicted someone might change jobs, she would sell that intelligence to both their current employer and potential new employers. She was essentially trafficking in future possibilities, using private information to influence real-world outcomes. During a break, Richard shared a disturbing discovery from the HOA's own investigation. They had found evidence that Margaret had been using her prediction system to influence property values in the neighborhood. She would strategically release or withhold information to affect home sales, he explained to the waiting residents. If she wanted property values to drop in a certain area, she'd make sure potential buyers learned about problems with those houses. She was playing the real estate market using our private lives as currency. The day's final witness was a data privacy expert who would analyze the full scope of Margaret's prediction system. His testimony revealed that she had been collecting data points most residents didn't even know existed. The system tracked everything from changes in grocery shopping patterns to variations in utility usage, he explained. Ms. Wellington believed that every aspect of daily life could be quantified, predicted, and ultimately controlled. She wasn't just violating privacy, she was trying to weaponize it. The expert's analysis showed that Margaret had been developing increasingly sophisticated prediction models. She had plans to expand beyond individual behavior to predict and influence community-wide trends. She called it social engineering through data management, he testified. The defendant believed that with enough surveillance data, she could shaped the entire community's development. She was essentially trying to create a controlled social experiment. As the day wound down, the prosecution revealed their final piece of evidence: Margaret's personal journal entries about her ultimate goals. The entries showed a disturbing progression from simple surveillance to grandiose plans for social control. "Today's emergency coordinator, tomorrow's community architect," one entry read. "With enough data, you can predict anything. With enough predictions, you can control everything. Privacy is just an obstacle to perfect social engineering." The journal entries effectively destroyed any remaining sympathy for Margaret's mental health defense. These weren't the writings of someone disconnected from reality. They were the calculated plans of someone who saw privacy violation as a path to power. The final day of trial began with closing arguments. The prosecution methodically laid out how Margaret had built her surveillance empire, emphasizing the calculated nature of her actions with a devastating timeline of evidence. "This was never about emergency preparedness," the prosecutor began. "Every step Ms. Wellington took was designed to expand her surveillance network and monetize her neighbors' private lives. She didn't just violate privacy, she turned it into a commodity." Using a series of visual aids, the prosecutor showed how Margaret had systematically developed her operation over 5 years. What started as basic security cameras had evolved into an AI-powered prediction system with international clients and franchise plans. "The defendant wants you to believe she was overzealous about community safety," the prosecutor continued. "But her own records tell a different story. Every camera installed, every microphone hidden, every piece of data collected was part of a business plan. She tracked her profits as carefully as she tracked her neighbors." The prosecution displayed Margaret's financial records, showing how her surveillance income had grown from a few $1,000s a month to over 6 figures. They highlighted specific transactions where she had sold particularly sensitive information. For premium prices, Ms. Wellington created different pricing tiers for privacy violations, the prosecutor explained. Basic surveillance footage might cost a few $100s, but intimate conversations or embarrassing moments, those could command thousands. She literally put a price tag on people's private lives. The defense's closing argument attempted to return to their mental health strategy, suggesting that Margaret's detailed record-keeping was evidence of obsessive-compulsive disorder rather than criminal intent. "My client became fixated on community safety," her lawyer argued. "Yes, she went too far, but her actions were driven by an overwhelming need to protect, not a desire for profit." This argument crumbled when the prosecution displayed Margaret's marketing materials for her surveillance franchise program. The sleek brochures and detailed profit projections showed nothing but cold business calculation. "These are not the actions of someone lost in delusion," the prosecutor countered. "The defendant created business plans, marketing strategies, and pricing models. She developed franchise agreements and client contracts. She built an entire corporate structure around privacy violation." As the jury began deliberations, the residents gathered in the courthouse waiting room. The FBI used this time to share one final discovery. They had found Margaret's list of planned expansion targets. She had identified 50 other communities across the country, Agent Parker explained. Each one was analyzed for surveillance potential with detailed plans for infiltration and equipment installation. This would have been just the beginning, if she hadn't been caught. The jury returned surprisingly quickly. After only 4 hours of deliberation, they had reached a verdict on all counts. As we filed back into the courtroom, Margaret sat stone-faced at the defense table, her emergency coordinator persona long abandoned. "On the count of criminal enterprise operation, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the count of unauthorized surveillance, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the count of wire fraud, how do you find?" "Guilty." The guilty verdicts continued for nearly 15 minutes. as the jury foreman read through all 37 counts. Margaret showed no reaction, staring straight ahead as her surveillance empire officially crumbled. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, but made it clear that given the scope of the crimes and the number of victims, he intended to impose the maximum penalties available. The defendant systematically violated the privacy of an entire community, he stated. She turned trust into a weapon and safety concerns into a cover for criminal enterprise. This court intends to send a clear message about the seriousness of these offenses. As we left the courthouse, news cameras captured Margaret being led away in handcuffs. The image would later become symbolic in privacy rights discussions. The self-appointed emergency coordinator finally facing consequences for her actions. Back in the neighborhood, residents gathered in the community center to process the verdict. The HOA board announced plans to create a permanent privacy protection committee to prevent any future surveillance schemes. We learned the hard way that safety and privacy have to be balanced, Richard told the assembled neighbors. Margaret exploited our desire for security to violate our trust. We won't let that happen again. Mrs. Chen, ever practical, had already organized a community-wide security audit. This time, she said, we'll know exactly where every camera is, who controls it, and how the footage is used. Real safety comes from transparency, not secret surveillance. A month after the verdict, we gathered in the courthouse for Margaret's sentencing hearing. The prosecution had prepared impact statements from dozens of residents, each describing how her surveillance operation had affected their lives. The judge listened intently as people shared their experiences of violated trust and invaded privacy. Your Honor, Sarah testified, I can't walk to my car without wondering if someone's watching. I check for hidden cameras every time I leave. My house. Ms. Wellington didn't just violate our privacy, she stole our peace of mind. The sentencing hearing revealed even more about the scope of Margaret's operation. The FBI had completed their analysis of her backup servers, discovering surveillance data from test operations in 3 other states. She had been piloting her system in different communities, fine-tuning her methods before settling on our neighborhood for her main operation. The defendant wasn't just building a business, the prosecutor argued during sentencing recommendations. She was developing a franchise model for privacy violation. Each community was a testbed for more sophisticated surveillance techniques. When Margaret finally addressed the court, her statement showed no real remorse. Instead, she attempted to justify her actions as necessary for modern community safety. In an age of increasing threats, she declared, privacy is a small price to pay for security. The judge was having none of it. Ms. Wellington, he responded, you didn't protect this community. You terrorized it. You turned neighbors into commodities and trust into a transaction. Your actions represent a fundamental betrayal of community values. The sentence was severe. 25 years in federal prison, millions in fines and restitution, and a lifetime ban from working in any security-related field. The judge also ordered all her surveillance equipment and data storage devices destroyed, with only essential evidence preserved for potential future legal proceedings. Let this sentence send a clear message, the judge declared. Privacy is not a commodity to be bought and sold. Trust is not a weakness to be exploited, and community safety is not an excuse for criminal enterprise. Back in Willow Creek Estates, the community began the long process of healing. The HOA implemented new transparency requirements for all security measures. Every camera had to be clearly marked, with public logs showing who accessed any footage and why. Mrs. Chen led the effort to transform our experience into something positive. She worked with privacy rights organizations to develop guidelines for other communities, helping them spot warning signs of surveillance abuse. We learned the hard way. she told a group of visiting HOA representatives, but we can help others protect themselves. Margaret may have taught us to be suspicious, but she also taught us to be vigilant. The FBI used our case to create a new training program for identifying and investigating community surveillance operations. Agent Parker regularly consulted with other field officers dealing with similar cases, sharing insights from our experience. What happened in Willow Creek Estates wasn't unique, he explained during a law enforcement conference. We're seeing similar operations across the country. The difference is your community fought back and won. The most lasting change came in how we related to each other as neighbors. The experience had taught us that real community safety comes from connection and transparency, not surveillance and control. We started monthly community meetings where people could raise concerns openly without fear of retaliation or monitoring. Tom organized a Reclaim Our Space initiative, helping residents sweep their homes for any remaining surveillance equipment and installing security measures they could actually control. The project became a way for neighbors to support each other and rebuild trust. Every camera we find and remove is another piece of our privacy restored, he said during one sweep. Every security decision we make together is another step toward real community safety. The media attention eventually faded, but our story had lasting impact. Privacy rights organizations used our case to advocate for stronger protections against unauthorized surveillance. Several states passed new laws specifically addressing community-based surveillance abuse. As for my truck that started it all, it's still parked in my driveway, but now it represents something different, a reminder that standing up to abuse of power, no matter how small it seems at first, can lead to real change. 1 year after Margaret's sentencing, we held a neighborhood celebration, not to commemorate her downfall, but to celebrate our community's resilience. The event included a symbolic decommissioning of the last known surveillance camera from her network, which had been preserved as evidence. "This isn't just about getting rid of cameras," Richard said, as he ceremonially dismantled the device. "It's about choosing what kind of community we want to be, one built on trust and respect, not surveillance and fear." 2 years after Margaret's sentencing, our story had evolved from a neighborhood scandal into a cautionary tale studied by privacy advocates nationwide. The FBI's investigation had ultimately uncovered surveillance operations in 12 other communities, all following Margaret's playbook. Each discovery led back to her training programs and consultation services. I was invited to speak at a national conference on community security, sharing our experience with HOA boards from across the country. The questions always followed a similar pattern. How did we not notice sooner? What were the warning signs? How could other communities protect themselves? The biggest red flag, I explained to the packed conference room, was how she used emergency preparedness as a shield. Anytime someone questioned her actions, she'd wrap herself in the language of safety and security. She turned our natural desire to feel protected into a weapon against us. The conference revealed that Margaret's influence had spread further than we'd imagined. Several attendees shared stories about suspicious emergency coordinators in their own communities, using eerily similar tactics. The FBI had started a task force specifically dedicated to investigating these copycat operations. We've identified at least 30 individuals who downloaded Margaret's training materials, Agent Parker updated us during a community meeting. Some had already begun implementing her surveillance systems. Thanks to your case, we knew exactly what to look for. Back in Willow Creek Estates, the changes were profound and permanent. Our new community safety program, designed with input from legitimate emergency response professionals, became a model for other neighborhoods. It emphasized transparency, resident involvement, and clear boundaries between safety measures and privacy rights. The irony Richard noted during a board meeting, is that we're actually safer now than we ever were under Margaret's surveillance. Real security comes from community connection, not constant monitoring. The legal ramifications continued to unfold. Margaret's case led to a series of class action lawsuits against companies that had purchased her surveillance data. The settlements resulted in the creation of a victim compensation fund and strict new guidelines for private investigation firms dealing with community surveillance. Sarah, whose medical career had been threatened by Margaret's blackmail attempts, helped draft new privacy protection protocols for healthcare workers. We need to recognize that privacy isn't just about physical spaces, she testified before a state legislative committee. It's about protecting people's right to live without fear of constant observation and judgment. Mrs. Chen's son, the fire chief, worked with emergency services nationwide to develop legitimate community safety programs that respected privacy rights. Margaret exploited a real need, he explained during a training session. Communities do need emergency preparedness, but it has to be based on trust and transparency, not surveillance and control. The technology industry also felt the impact. Companies developing neighborhood security systems had to prove their commitment to privacy protection. The Margaret Wellington case, as it became known in legal circles, set new standards for balancing security features with privacy rights. Tom's Reclaim Our Space initiative expanded into a national program, helping communities audit their security measures and establish privacy protection protocols. Every week, we find more cameras and devices installed without proper authorization, he reported. Margaret may be in prison, but her influence created a surveillance culture we're still fighting. The most significant change was in how we viewed community itself. The experience had taught us that true neighborhood safety isn't about watching each other, but about watching out for each other. Monthly community meetings became opportunities for genuine connection, not surveillance reports, as for the driveway that started it all. It became something of a symbol. New residents would hear the story during their welcome orientation, not to frighten them, but to emphasize our commitment to privacy and genuine community safety. Margaret's appeal attempts were all denied, with courts consistently upholding her sentence. Her surveillance empire had crumbled completely, her equipment destroyed, her data wiped from servers. But her case had sparked a national conversation about privacy rights and community trust that continued to shape policies and laws. You know what's really ironic? Mrs. Chen said during our final community meeting of the year. Margaret claimed she was protecting us from emergencies, but she never understood that trust is the real foundation of community safety. In trying to control everything, she lost sight of what actually makes a neighborhood secure. Looking back now, it's clear that our story was about more than just one person's abuse of power. It was about how easily our desire for safety can be manipulated and how important it is to question anyone who demands surveillance in the name of security. The emergency response coordinator who once terrorized our neighborhood with her cameras and threats had inadvertently taught us the most valuable lesson about community safety. Real security comes from connecting with our neighbors, not from watching their every move. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.